Ooh, hey, good morning. Still morning. Good morning, everybody. And thanks for being here today. We're going to make an exciting announcement with regard to our resource base here in the state of Alaska. And it's going to be, I think, a pretty good conversation piece here over the next several months in the state of Alaska, and quite possibly for some time to come. And that has to do with the monetization of carbon, the concept of carbon, the element, the molecules of carbon, and the various ways that carbon can be monetized. We all know that carbon oftentimes is a byproduct of combustion, fossil fuels, burning of wood, et cetera. And there's been a lot of discussion about carbon over the past several decades, if not longer, in terms of its impacts, negative or positive, on the environment and on the economies of the world. Nonetheless, Alaska is poised and has a real potential to monetize and capitalize upon the discussions regarding carbon. So, as we know, a number of our native corporations, for some time, at least since 2015, have actually been monetizing lands underneath their jurisdiction for the purpose of sequestering carbon in the timber that grows on their lands. And there is a market, and this market is growing, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. The state of Alaska is fortunate in that we have approximately 1/7 of the country's timber here in the state of Alaska, millions and millions and millions of acres of timber. We also have the longest coastline of any state in the country. As a matter of fact, put together, Alaska's coastline is actually longer than the entire lower 48 put together. This bodes well for the potential of sequestering carbon in seaweed as well. And we have two large oil and gas basins in the state of Alaska, Cook Inlet, obviously, as well as the North Slope. At Cook Inlet, being right out the window here from our office and where we're actually doing this press conference right now, has some real potential and potential that could happen very soon in terms of sequestering the physical carbon in that basin. As a matter of fact, the capacity for that basin to sequester carbon, some estimates have it at 50 gigatons of carbon, which would be equal to what Japan, the country of Japan, produces in terms of carbon for the next 50 years. So the potential for Alaska is absolutely enormous. Now, the question, of course, is what amount of money could Alaska realize in this process? And we'll talk about that here in a moment as well. But make no doubt about it, Alaska's entry into the carbon markets is going to be a game changer, not just for the country, not just for Alaska, but for the world, because of our potential at sequestering carbon. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a number of folks come up and talk, but we start out here in the state of Alaska, obviously, by looking at our obligations under the Constitution, and we have an obligation under the Constitution, under natural resources, to maximize our resources to the benefit of the people of Alaska, and that's what we're going to be doing here. A couple of things that will come up is, will this new concept of monetizing carbon displace legacy industries, for example, such as oil, gas, or timber? And it won't. Alaska is big enough to be able to provide all kinds of opportunities, and that's really the thought I want people to be left with. Some have viewed Alaska over the last several decades as an either-or place. You're either going to do this industry or that industry, but you can't do both. I've never really believed that that has to be the reality. Again, I think Alaska is big enough. We have resources across the board in many forms that Alaska could capitalize on and monetize all of these opportunities. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to Commissioner Boyle, Acting Commissioner Boyle, Commissioner Designee, all kinds of terms we've got for you, John, who will talk just briefly about the carbon concept. And then he'll be turning it over to Commissioner Crowther, who will also add to it. And then Commissioner Crowther will turn it over to our folks we have on contract that will talk even more about carbon, and that would be Nick. So with that, Commissioner Boyle, you want to come up, please, and say a few words?
Sure. Well, thank you, Governor Dunleavy. I think irrespective of the titles that we bear, this is really an exciting new chapter for the state. And, the governor's vision here to create a new and an emerging market with carbon management, I think, is something that will clearly benefit all Alaskans. As the governor alluded, Article 8 of our Constitution spells out that DNR's mission is to develop, conserve, and maximize the state's natural resources consistent with the public interest. And of course, exploring these emerging carbon markets and opportunities is clearly in Alaska's best interest. And as the governor mentioned, these initiatives will work in harmony with our existing industries like mining, oil and gas, forestry, outdoor recreation, tourism, to further improve the business and operating environment here in the state. And first, I really wanted to give a shout out to some of our divisions within DNR that really put in a lot of effort, that have worked closely with the governor's team to develop this legislation. The divisions of forestry and fire protection, mining, land and water, oil and gas, and geological and geophysical surveys, who've put in a lot of work and effort to fine-tune and help steer this legislation. And I also wanted to thank our sister agencies like the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation and the Alaska Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, as well as the University of Alaska, who've also contributed people and know-how to help us develop this package. So in essence, this legislation is going to give DNR the authority to continue exploring how carbon management projects can work in Alaska and really give us the flexibility to manage this rapidly evolving industry. The bill package establishes statutory authority, rules, and processes for leasing state subsurface land for carbon capture, utilization, and storage methods, commonly referred to as CCUS. It creates operating rules, regulatory and oversight authority, and liability provisions for these CCUS projects here in the state, or on whether that is on state lands or private lands. Second, the bill package also establishes the authority for DNR to market carbon offsets. And lastly, the bill provides DNR the authority to lease state lands for purposes that include carbon offset projects. So what we're doing here is we're proposing a broad and flexible framework that will enable us to cover this growing and nascent market and take advantage of some of these opportunities that are presenting themselves with respect to carbon management. And really what this does is it burnishes the state's environmental, social, and governance credentials. This is something that fits in very well with the pride that we take as Alaskans to live in a state with a robust regulatory and permitting environment that enables us to develop our resources here better than in any other jurisdiction. Carbon offsets is, a program, an opportunity that is still somewhat in its infancy, but Alaska is well positioned here to be a leader in this space by building on the state's existing skill base and regulatory structures. And of course, our stable and trusted regulatory environment can translate to higher premiums for tons of carbon that are stored here in Alaska versus other jurisdictions around the world. So what we're going to be asking for is we need legislators to give us, DNR, the authority and flexibility to manage this emerging market for the benefit of all Alaskans. And of course, that means passing the governor's carbon management bill package this session. So DNR staff will be in Juneau throughout the session to provide information, answer questions, and assist legislators as they work to advance this legislation. And right now, I'd like to turn it over to Deputy Commissioner John Crowther, who can go into a few more of the details around this program.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and I thank you to the governor for his vision and direction to really seize this opportunity on behalf of Alaska and to enable and empower the Department of Natural Resources to pursue it aggressively to the benefit of our state and our people. Just to speak a little bit more about the provisions in the bill package, the Department of Natural Resources already manages the state's vast land portfolio, approximately 100 million acres of uplands, 65 million acres of tide and submerged lands. And the bill package would provide the authority for the state to adopt a program of leasing and management of all of those lands and resources to potentially generate carbon offsets, carbon management projects. And that's consistent. We already balance and manage a variety of uses in the public interest, everything, as the commissioner noted, from recreation to natural resource development of all kinds. And the terms of those leases would enable these projects as the governor mentioned, the flexible and dynamic ways they're developing so that we'd be able to maximize, as is consistent with our mandate, the use and development of our resources. Similarly, the bill package would enable the state to participate in the management, facilitation, and marketing of carbon offsets themselves. And that's, as the governor and commissioner mentioned, that's because these markets are developing, the contracts and projects that are facilitating carbon management are developing, and we want to have the maximum flexibility necessary for the state to support them in all the different ways they can. The third portion of the bill will address the geologic or carbon capture and underground or in utilization and storage, the underground storage of carbon, the injection of carbon underground. And as referenced, these authorities and processes very similar to the existing experience and authorities we have to manage our subsurface oil and gas resources. Extensive experience in our division of oil and gas to do so, and we're going to be building on that to enable CCUS projects. And so with that quick summary, I'd like to introduce our expert consultant who has experience in carbon management projects all around the world, Nick Fulford, a Senior Director of Gaffney Klein. Nick, please come on up.
Thank you very much, Deputy Commissioner. Well, good morning, everybody. As you can probably tell, I'm not originally from around here, but I'm very excited about the opportunity for the carbon industry here in Alaska. So let's take a step back and look at some of the global events which are really influencing what's happening here locally. So let's look at the compliance market, first of all. So right now, around a quarter of global CO2 emissions are covered by some kind of compliance regulation, whether it be carbon tax or some kind of trading scheme. And even given the very significant disruption in energy markets globally over the last year or so, the momentum behind carbon pricing and carbon markets is continuing. So as things stand today, there's a price of, give or take, $100 a ton being placed on the value of carbon in the energy value chain. So what does that mean? That means that the traditional energy customers for Alaska are now looking to have to manage their carbon emissions very carefully. And at a rate of $100 per ton, this starts to materially affect the energy value chain. So for a state like Alaska, which has such a strong tradition in oil and gas, being able to offer a decarbonized energy product immediately puts Alaska on a much more competitive framework globally. So let's look closer to home and look at how that $100 a ton is affecting investment. So if you look particularly in other parts of the lower 48 and in parts of Asia and elsewhere, the amount of capital that's being allocated now to natural gas, blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, which is coupled with this kind of carbon capture technology that the governor has talked about, these are now attracting very substantial amounts of capital. Most of the big infrastructure funds in New York and on the West Coast are aggressively competing to put capital in this new and exciting market. And so we're looking at a kind of a burgeoning opportunity, and just in terms of a kind of an adjunct to the traditional oil and gas activities that have existed here in the state for many years, and activities which, from the point of view of technology and regulatory oversight and so forth, lend themselves to the type of history which has gone on here. So that's the compliance market, and that's the kind of physical effect of capturing CO2, of injecting it into the ground. It's a very measurable, a very physically sort of controlled process. So let's turn for a moment to emissions. As we've heard, it's very much an emerging sector. There's very little global regulation around the voluntary market currently, so the quality of emissions matters a lot. And in that context as well, with Alaska's traditions in resource husbandry and so forth, I think, as Alaska begins to enter this market, the dependability and the resilience of some of the resource management techniques which have been used for decades will start to show value. So how big is that market? Well, it depends whose forecast you take, but it doesn't really matter. Whichever forecast you take, we're looking at a market that's growing by more than $10 billion per annum over the rest of the decade. So, as that market grows and as Alaska establishes itself with this enabling legislation that's being talked about now as a global player, it's a very deep and growing market which can be accessed. And so if you take those two things in combination, you've got the traditional skills of the oil and gas industry, the CCUS, the injection of CO2. You've got the other big resource management activity, which has such strong traditions here in Alaska, forestry and related things. So if you take carbon as a whole in aggregate, you've got this huge opportunity for the oil and gas sector. You've also got this emerging opportunity for forestry. And in effect, you've combined two of perhaps the most important industries here in the state. So I think as we look forward to the next few years and as this enabling legislation is debated and goes through, for me, there's a lot of opportunity there, which I'm sure we'll see a lot of very good outcomes. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to the governor, who will carry on with today's meeting.
Thanks, Nick. And we're going to open this up for questions in a moment, but there's going to be a couple things that I know people are going to ask, and that is, does this turn Alaska lands into parklands? It doesn't. This is another opportunity on our state lands for us to monetize for people in Alaska. Does it eliminate things, as Nick was talking about, forestry, mining, oil and gas? It doesn't. As a matter of fact, we've been having discussions and working on plans to actually increase our timber harvest on our lands. So this is not a displacer of industry. This is just a brand new opportunity that will enhance and work hand in glove with the industries that we currently have. And so, again, our charge at the state, my charge, the people behind me, their charge by Constitution is that we have to maximize the benefits of our resources. This helps maximize the benefits. This will help also, as I mentioned, continue our traditional industries, I believe, well into the future, which bodes well for Alaska and bodes well for customers. And so with that, we're going to open this up for questions. We got a lot of folks up here that hopefully can answer all your questions, and we're going to continue this discussion throughout this session with the legislature. So where's Jeff? Oh, Shannon.
All right, up first, we have Iris Samuels with Anchorage Daily News.
Thanks. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the timeline as you see it for any of these particular projects.
Yeah, so first we have to get enabling language passed through the legislature, just so that we are clear to be able to start to have discussions with the actors, the players across the world in carbon. It depends. For example, we have leases and leasability like we do now with our mariculture industry on seaweed and things like oysters. That particular approach to carbon could probably happen rapidly through leases and folks that may want to invest in the state of Alaska in terms of sequestering carbon potentially in seaweed. When it comes to the carbon capture and then putting into our basins, that's a discussion that's happening now with folks, for example, in Japan that are looking at our gas line as a real possibility. The timelines on the sequestration in the basin and the timelines on maximizing the benefits of carbon, for example, in our forests, I would say, from what I'm hearing from the experts, is several months to a year and a half to really get things going. But again, you're not going to go from zero to X amount of millions of acres at that point, but you're going to ramp up as we become part of the market, we become a growing force in the market. We believe Alaska will be, for lack of a better term, the big dog in the market over time. The other thing about Alaska, and this is why we need broad enabling language, is it's probably the only state that nobody has a basin, a depleted basin like we do at Cook Inlet on the West Coast. No state does. We have 1/7 of the country's timber, so we have more timber than any other state. And nobody has the coastline like we do. So just because of our scale and our size, we will end up being a huge, huge player. It's going to take a little bit of time, but the sooner we get the enabling language, what happens then is you start to get outfits that then make inquiries. And there are outfits that are making inquiries now, but this enables us to have a sit-down conversation with them. So we're hoping as soon as possible, but I think we could start to see discussions, agreements, and capital flowing into Alaska within a few months to a year and a half.
All right, next we have Nat Hertz, Northern Journal. I'm good. You good? Okay. We're going to move to online. Up first, we have Tim Bradner, if you have a question.
Governor, thanks for doing this. I heard the term liability in the legislation package. As I understand, one of the issues in the lower 48 with carbon sequestration is who carries the liability if
It's like a bonding approach.
if it doesn't work and if the carbon seeps back out. What's the idea for handling the problem here? Excuse me. Did you get the question?
Bonding liability. Yeah, we did. We're just deciding which team member is going to talk to you. Go ahead.
And if you could also say your name and title before you speak.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No,
This is
no,
Tim
not
Bradner.
you. Sorry. I meant sorry. Deputy
Yeah.
Commissioner.
Hello, Tim. This is John Crowther, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. So you're right. The Commissioner did mention that that's one of the topics that will be covered in the legislation package. We don't want to talk about the exact details of the bills until they're introduced, but you're absolutely right that there's a variety of financial mechanisms and structures to cover bonding and the associated liability. And so the legislation will contemplate those. The department has been working with a variety of groups to do an assessment of how other states treat that same issue. So we have a lot of information to go on. And then, of course, we anticipate, the legislature to review and debate that topic. And we'll be there to provide information and our experience and what we've learned. If that answers your question, Tim.
Yeah, if I just make one more follow-up, is it a potential that the state might backstop liability on this, or would there be private markets for bonding?
So, and again, without talking too specifically to the particulars of the legislation, it is true that some jurisdictions have some assumption of liability in the longer term by the landowner and the underlying jurisdiction. So that's certainly an option that we're looking closely at. There's also, as you mentioned, both bonding and insurance markets that are developing around these projects. As Nick Fulford mentioned, a tremendous amount of capital that's being invested in these, and that's one of the things that's being actively developed is frameworks to manage that longer-term liability. So it's something that we absolutely will be in the legislation.
All right. Thank you, Deputy
Great.
Commissioner.
Well, thank you.
Next, we have Jeff Landfield.
Hi, Governor. I just wanted to ask about your recent OMB 10-year plan, and it shows on there, over the next 10 years, significant new revenues and even some small deficits. And it doesn't really list much. How much are you relying on this to cover those new projected revenues in the 10-year plan? And then how much are you relying on potentially other forms of new revenue?
So, good question, Jeff. We want to act quickly on this form of revenue, this potential moneymaker for the state of Alaska, but we also understand at the same time that the legislature is going to be engaged and will engage with them in potential other revenues as well. As you know, Jeff, over the last several years, the question seems to always come to me, what am I going to suggest for revenues? What am I going to suggest to bring income to Alaska? Well, this is another one of my suggestions, and it has incredible potential. So this administration right now is focused on this particular issue to try and get it past the finish line. But again, there's 61 folks, including myself, 60 legislators, and they have always been free and really should be thinking about what are some other methods to bring wealth into the state of Alaska. I've always been somewhat hesitant to just look at what I call old, traditional, sometimes tired approaches, and that is taking $1 out of your pocket, Jeff, to give it to the guy next to you. This creates new wealth, and it creates wealth that comes in from the outside, which I think is exactly what we want for the monetization of carbon with our resources. And so it's consistent with what I think Alaskans want. I think it's consistent, certainly what I want, and that is creation of new wealth. With regard to other forms of revenue, again, nothing's preventing the legislature from coming up with some great ideas as well.
Great. Okay, next we have Anna Canny with KTOO.
Hi, thanks for the presentation. One question I have, there's a lot of emphasis on new wealth coming in from outside the state, as you mentioned. Obviously, Alaska also has pretty high rate of carbon emissions created right here in state, and I'm wondering if there's any consideration of some sort of matchup or matching in-state businesses or folks who might want to be limiting their carbon emissions, with this in-state development of carbon management, like I said, within the state, because those should be matched up hypothetically in some way, and I'm wondering if there's any consideration of
As a business, they probably will want to be involved in this whole carbon market and carbon discussion, absolutely. So we anticipate that that'll occur as well.
All right, next we have Mark Sabatini, Juneau Empire.
Hi. Can you tell me how much and what kind of upfront costs are going to be involved in this?
For the state of Alaska,
Yes.
does anyone want to take a stab at that? Want to identify yourself?
Yeah, hello, this is John Crowther, Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Natural Resources. So we're not anticipating significant upfront costs as far as capital outlays. The purpose of this legislation is to open the doors for opportunity for people who want to expend those resources. Certainly going forward, the state may want to, subject to the governor's direction, and the legislature may want to do things to characterize our potential even further, to promote, advertise, enable projects. But we're not anticipating really any substantial costs to open these opportunities up. And the legislation is to enable the departments to pursue it and really see what comes.
Thank you. Next we have Lisa Fu with Alaska Beacon. Lisa, do you have any questions? We'll come back. Next, we have Becky Bohrer, Associated Press.
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is for the Deputy Commissioner, maybe for Nick, but for those of us who are new to this topic and this discussion, can you give sort of a practical or real-world example of how this would work, maybe using, the examples of that we've seen with one of the native corporations, but I'm just trying to understand and picture how this would work, if you could talk about that.
Okay, it's Nick Fulford, Gaffney Klein, working with DNR in the Governor's Office. I think it's useful perhaps to take a look down to the lower 48 and look at some of the projects there which are being invested in and developed at the moment. For example, with the 45Q tax credits, which obviously apply here as well, we're seeing a very significant ramp up in the development of energy export projects in that part of the world. So, for example, this might involve the use of natural gas to create ammonia. The ammonia would attract credits with European and Asian customers. And so, these companies are able to attract a kind of, or sell a premium product by exporting it from the US with these low carbon attributes. So I would say that's quite a hot spot. The other practical area, which certainly has application here in Alaska, is, as I'm sure everyone on the call is aware, there has been this tremendous wave of investment in LNG exports from the lower 48. Most of those projects are either developing a carbon capture project in partnership with a sequestration provider, or they're taking their own steps to lease acreage from the state, from Louisiana, for example, to develop that acreage as a carbon sequestration point, and therefore to sell a low-carbon LNG to customers in Asia or Europe. So these are very real, practical examples of, how, as I mentioned, you've got tens of millions, probably billions of dollars being deployed right now, with a very willing series of lenders who are very keen to access this market. So I hope those examples provide some sense check, if you like, a reality check. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. And Becky, keep in mind that since 2015, and I take my hats off to some of our native corporations, they've realized about $350 million on 350,000 acres of land. So that's a small example. And there's projects such as this ongoing in the lower 48 with private landowners as well with regard to timber. But Well, Alaska is probably the leader, quite honestly, in the country on low carbon or net zero. So the gas line project, for example, has the ability to be a net zero project. I think it'd be the only one in the world. We don't flare our gas in the slope. If the pipeline goes through, there'll be a conditioning plant on the slope that will strip out the carbon and inject it into the basin up there on the slope. The gas will flow down the pipeline to the coast, most likely in the Nikiski area, where the basin is there for Cook Inlet. And if our Asian partners or other partners wish to begin the process of blue hydrogen by knocking off the carbon to create hydrogen there, that carbon can then be put into the inlet. And so very low, if not net zero approach to carbon. And again, this is an issue that's being monetized across the world, and Alaska, I think, is in a position to take advantage of this and become a world leader in it.
All right, next we have James Brooks with Alaska Beacon.
Thank you. Am I coming through all right?
Yep.
This is probably a question for DNR, but speaking to geologic sequestration, how would that affect the existing enhanced oil recovery programs that are already injecting carbon dioxide to some degree or another on the North Slope?
Yeah, Deputy Commissioner John Crowther from DNR. So in short summary, we view them as consistent and part of a spectrum of opportunity. So, that those existing operations could certainly continue. New operations might be enabled either for enhanced oil recovery or for pure sequestration. So, we view it as just a development and growth of the field of subsurface carbon management, and not in any way a change to those ongoing processes. If that answers your question, James.
I think so. And just a brief follow-up for Nick. Had a question regarding a Wood Mackenzie study that came out, I believe it was last year, that suggested that basins with access to large amounts of cheap renewable power will have a competitive advantage on carbon sequestration markets. And they've rated the North Slope low on that front, and I'm curious about your thoughts about the North Slope's competitiveness given the market for these.
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's Nick Fulford here again. The context of the WoodMac report, I think, is in the sphere of what's called direct air capture, which is using technology to remove CO2 from the atmosphere and inject it in geologically intact reservoirs. It's a very, very intensive process from an energy perspective. So for that to work, it needs large amounts of cheap renewable power to keep the carbon content down. But in the context of what we're talking about today with blue hydrogen, blue ammonia, and so forth, the combination of the North Slope and the Cook Inlet geological storage potential, together with the gas resources in the state, it is a very good blend. And certainly for the next 2 to 3 decades, I think we could see this type of technology being at the forefront of investments, and with a gradual emergence of direct air capture and technologies of that sort starting to build up as the technology gets better and the costs start to reduce. Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. And can I do one more follow-up, Shannon?
Really quick.
Yeah, if we're not envisioning direct air capture right now, how necessary, and this is probably a general question for anyone in the room, is this kind of carbon capture in order to keep the North Slope producing oil as companies emphasize zero carbon oil and low emission oil? How much is this needed to keep Alaska an oil state?
I think for me, this whole debate comes down to economics. As the value that the world places on carbon increases, the amount of capital and cost that can be sustained to manage carbon also increases. And as we've seen in other, petroleum-rich environments in the Middle East, etc., I think, there's certainly a prerequisite for major oil-producing regions of the world to investigate ways to manage carbon, and Alaska is no different in that respect. I think for some of the reasons that we've talked about in this meeting, Alaska's potential to offer a low-carbon product is arguably better than many other traditionally oil and gas producing regions. So, in that sense, the proof will be in the pudding, and we'll see what happens over the next few years. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Next, we have Eric Stone, KRBD.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
All right, so I'm curious how large a role you see mariculture, and I'm thinking kelp farming, but I'm open to others. I'm curious how large a role mariculture might play in this plan, and what might be done to make the kelp farming industry competitive with some perhaps lower cost carbon offsets.
Yeah, we see a huge upside and huge potential, obviously because of our coastline, the size of our coastline, and the fact that we've been leasing our tidelands and our offshore lands to members of the mariculture industry now for a few years. We actually have the fastest permitting process in the country. So our scale and size, once again, really bodes well for Alaska in that particular approach to sequestering carbon. And keep in mind, the seaweed industry, as it grows, and hopefully it's going to grow tremendously sooner than later, it's not just carbon sequestration that could be part of that. It's actual raising certain kelps for certain animal feeds that science has demonstrated can actually lower methane, for example, in livestock. So I would say that we see huge upside, huge potential, and that's what, again, makes Alaska very unique amongst all the states. Our coastline for kelp, our basins for capturing the carbon and putting it in the basins, and the fact that we have 1/7 of the country's timber, I think across the board, puts Alaska in the front seat in terms of carbon, not just for this country, but for the world. So we see a lot of potential for seaweed. We were just at the mariculture conference this morning. They're all excited about this concept, and it's just going to take a little bit of time, but we anticipate this ramping up significantly.
Thank you. Next we have Kavitha George, Alaska Public Media.
Hi, Governor. I'm wondering, have you already had demonstrated interest from entities that are interested in CCUS projects on state land, and could you characterize those discussions?
Sure. We've had outfits contact us showing interest, wanting to talk with us. We've had some outfits actually come up and have discussions. There'll be a couple outfits that will be going to Juneau here next week to have discussions from their perspective. In other words, we're trying to inform everyone that this is a real method to monetize carbon in Alaska and real methods to capture carbon in Alaska. And so there will be private concerns in Juneau next week that will be having discussions with legislators as to how they see things from their perspective, from the business end of things. So we are having inquiries. We are having folks that are very interested.
All right, Governor, that was the last question. Now you can go to your closing comments.
Yeah, so it's this is somewhat new for the state, but not new for Alaska. Again, I take my hat off to the number of native corporations that have monetized carbon on their land. What I do want to say is, and I want to make sure people understand, again, this is not an either or. This is an add. This is another opportunity that will stand alongside of our timber industry, our mining industry, our oil and gas industry, and in many respects will complement those industries. The bottom line is there's a real potential for this to be low investment on the state side with high income possibilities, high revenue possibilities, and revenue that could occur and be sustained for some time. And so, again, we're all learning about this. It's an emerging, fast-growing market. And we're just asking Alaskans to do a little homework, ask the questions. We're also asking the legislature to do the same, and we're going to provide as many experts as possible so that we all feel pretty good as to where the state could go with this. But again, tremendous potential for Alaska, tremendous potential to be stood next to our traditional industries that we have here in the state of Alaska, and we continue to work with those that are interested in investing in Alaska nationally and worldwide. So good news, and hopefully we have better news as we go on in terms of inking contracts and getting bills passed. But we're looking forward to it, and we think it's a real opportunity. So with that, I want to thank everyone for being here today.